Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guest for the hour is Jane Mayer, staff writer for The New Yorker, author of the new book, Dark Money, The Hidden History of the Billionaires Behind the Rise of the Radical Right. If you think about what's happening in this country, the rise of inequality, why climate change action doesn't happen in a more systemic way, many different issues. Jane Mayer talks about some of the reasons, the power blocks behind the major obstacles, the block. Start with where you're getting your information.
Well, I interviewed hundreds of people for this, and I have many new documents also. I mean, one of the things that was interesting to me, I mean, I went into this kind of wondering, why does the government seem so dysfunctional? As you said, why can't something be done about global warming in Congress? All of the scientific community is going one way, Congress is going the other. American public opinion supports doing something about global warming. The Congress won't do anything. What's holding it up? Money. The fossil fuel interests and others, and you can see it in here. And it begins long ago, in about 1976, there was a plan laid by Charles Koch to build what he called a radical movement to change the way that America voted and thought. And he said we need to, quote unquote, destroy the statist paradigm and start a movement. And he modeled it on the John Birch Society. He loved the secrecy of the John Birch Society. And there's a paper that is quoted in here that he wrote in 1976 about how he was going to found a movement and launch it. So this has been a long running project, and he's built it up. He's an engineer. He's extraordinarily wealthy, and he's worked with a number of very smart people to build this network that tries to sort of push the country in his direction. And
you also talk, when it comes about climate change, the direct interest that Koch Industries has in climate denial, because you talk about their refinery, the Pine Bend refinery in Minnesota, and its importance in terms of polluting the planet. Sure, their fortune is built on fossil fuels. I mean, they are refiners, and they have tremendous numbers of pipelines, and they own a huge amount of the tar sands that are up in Canada. And so if America moved off fossil fuels, it would be catastrophic for their business. It's a direct interest that they've got in this. And so one of the things I do is try to follow the money in the denial of climate change. And an awful lot of it goes back to the Kochs and their circle. They have a number of other fossil fuel companies that are part of their network, their group, this group of 400 or so. The members are secret, but there's one guest list that actually was left behind somewhere. So we've been able to see a little bit of who the members are, at least at one point. And it includes many well-known players and a number of fossil fuel interests. I wanted to ask you about the hedge fund people that apparently are involved as well. Stephen Schwarzman of Blackstone, Cohen of SAC. Stephen Cohen of SAC Capital, yes. SAC Capital. No, there are a number of very well-known finance figures who are extraordinarily wealthy. And one of the things that this group has worked hard to do is to keep sort of tax breaks for billionaires, really, for hedge funds. One is the carried interest loophole, it's called, and they wanted to keep it open. There was talk in Congress that the Democrats might try to close it. And so this brought a flood of money from the finance community into this group to keep that loophole open for them. It means that hedge fund managers pay taxes at 15%, which is lower than almost, any decently paid American pays more in taxes than many of these people.
So let's talk about how they built their power. You got a hold of a several hundred-page history called Stealth, the history of Charles Koch's political activities. Where did this document come from? And tell us about the four brothers. It's not just two, Charles and David.
Well, this is the thing. It's an amazing family feud that took place inside this family. There are four brothers, as you say. Two of them formed one team, two formed the other team. They were in court for 20 years against each other, fighting over who was going to get to run the company and have more access to the family fortune. And one of the brothers who was estranged, his name is Bill Koch, commissioned a history. He hired a historian who'd actually been hired previously by Koch Industries to do its own history. So it was a historian who worked at George Mason University, and he did a history for Bill Koch of what the other brother, Charles, was doing politically. It's called Stealth because he describes a secret plan by Charles to try to manipulate American politics. It's fascinating. It's full of new details, including this paper that I mentioned that Charles wrote in 1976 that no one's seen before.
And part of the documents you uncovered was a sealed deposition, or at least information on a sealed deposition that involved the battle between the brothers, an attempt by Charles and David to blackmail their own the eldest brother, Frederick, and to out him as gay, according to the deposition. Can you talk about that?
It's true. It was. This is really, a painful scene in this, and I think. But gives you an idea of just how rough these guys play. You've got three brothers trying to set up the fourth, who they thought was gay, and they basically hold a kangaroo court. They invite him in under false pretexts. He walks into the room. The three of them are facing him in chairs, and he's supposed to sit across from them, and they accuse him of being gay. They say, "We're going to tell our father you're gay unless you give us your shares in the company." The brother that was accused, his name's Frederick, he's the oldest, he stood up and said, "I never want to hear about this again," and he walked out of the room. But all of this is described in a deposition that's remained sealed during all these years. Gives you just a glimpse, I think, of maybe how ruthless these players are.
How did you get a hold of it, and what happened with the company then, with Bill and Frederick?
Well, I can't say how I got a hold of it, but I can say that it is absolutely unrefuted, that this is the real thing. And the company was, for 20 years, there was fighting between these two sets of brothers, the 2 against 2. And in the end, Charles and David triumphed, and they run the company, own the company for the most part. There are a few other shares that a few scattered other people have, but basically they own virtually the whole company. And the 2 that were left out got decent-sized inheritances and went off in their own ways.
And now this is the only other part of your book that the Kochs directly challenged. They're claiming that this information on this court battle was especially the information in that position was eventually rejected by a jury, and that they triumphed, and that it was actually false allegations.
Which, the allegation that they blackmailed the brother?
Right.
No. Well, it says in the book that Charles denied it, but this is a deposition sworn to be true by Bill Koch, who was in the room at the time. So I think, take it for what it is. Facts are facts.
I want to turn to Charles Koch in his own words. Speaking at the Wichita Metro Chamber 2015 annual meeting, Koch was asked to explain what good profit is. His latest book is called Good Profit: How Creating Value for Others Built One of the World's Most Successful Companies. This is a part of what he said.
Good profit is creating superior value in society by helping your customers improve their lives. And a business does that by, as I say, by creating superior value for its customers and by more efficiently using resources and driving creative destruction. And while you're doing it, do the best job of keeping people safe and protecting the environment. And if you do a superior job of all those, believe me, you will be profitable. And if you don't, you won't last. That's our philosophy.
So that's Charles Koch speaking in his own words. And I wanted to talk about the company and the environment. Listen, in 2012, the EPA said that Koch Industries was the largest or the single biggest producer of toxic waste in the United States. In 2014, according to the Toxic Release Inventory, Koch Industries had consistently appeared among the top 5 U.S. producers of toxic waste.
Yeah, and there's a University of Massachusetts in Amherst study, too, that says that they're one of only 3 companies that has been among the top producers of air pollution, water pollution, and climate pollution. They have a huge history of environmental violations, and they say they've worked hard to improve on that, and I think they probably are better than they were way back in the 90s maybe, but at that point they had some of the largest environmental judgments against them that had ever been brought in the U.S. So they have a checkered history on this subject, and I was there in Wichita when Charles Koch gave that speech, and it certainly caught my ear when he mentioned that one of the things you need to do is have a good environmental record. I'm glad he thinks that's important.
So talk about climate change, as we just talked about it before, but go further with what they have done around this issue, the groups that have been set up, the money that has been funneled in to either obfuscate or deny human-induced climate change.
Well, what you have to understand is the Kochs have built kind of an assembly line to manufacture political change, and it includes think tanks which produce papers. It includes advocacy groups that advocate for policies, and it includes giving money to candidates. And you put those 3 together, and they've pushed against doing anything about climate change on all those 3 fronts at once. So you get papers that look like they're real scientific opinions doubting that climate change is real. You get advocacy groups saying we can't afford to do anything about it. And you get candidates who have to sign a pledge that their largest political group is Americans for Prosperity. They have a pledge that says that if you want to get money from this group, from their donors, you have to sign a pledge saying that if elected, you will do nothing about climate change that requires spending any money on the problem. And 156 members of Congress currently have signed that pledge. So it sort of is a recipe for how to tie the hands of the country from doing anything on this.
Well, what are some of these think tanks, and also talk about their role with ALEC?
Well, that's just the other thing that's so interesting is they've created a think tank and helped fund it in almost every state. In fact, in every state, there's at least one of these think tanks. It's called the State Policy Network. And they've worked with the group ALEC that you all probably know about, which sort of funnels corporate money into lobbying in state legislatures.
The American Legislative Exchange Council.
That's right, yeah. And so they have kind of, I mean, there's a reason that they won the name the Kochtopus. It's kind of tentacles on many different levels out there, and a lot of attention to state legislatures where money goes a lot further.
David Koch actually ran for Congress, is that right, in 1980?
He actually ran to become Vice President of the United States in 1980. And this is one of the questions I had was, so he ran in 1980 on the Libertarian ticket, and he got something like 1% of the vote. He spent a huge amount of it.
Not Congress, so for Vice President.
The Vice President. And it was so, which gives you an indication. They were so far right, they were running against Ronald Reagan because they thought he was too liberal. And so at that time, you have, they really defined the furthest fringe in America, and even conservatives denounced their views. William F. Buckley called their views anarcho-totalitarianism. So what interested me as a question, as a reporter, was how did this group, these 2 brothers and the others around them, get from the furthest fringe to the center of gravity in the Republican Party? It's pulled their way so far during these 30 years since then.
You mentioned this phrase that Buckley used, anarcho-totalitarianism. Talk about the Freedom School and how David Koch was involved with this little-known operation in Colorado, was it?
It is. It was in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Even before he ran as vice president on the Libertarian Party, he was, I guess, a young man in his 30s and was very attracted to this school called the Freedom School that was run by a man named Charles Lefebvre, who had had a very odd background. He'd had a lot of legal brushes, and they taught a kind of a fanatical libertarianism that was almost anarchism. The head of the school, this Lefebvre, called it himself an autarchist instead of an anarchist. They wanted to shrink the government to the point where they couldn't tax, the government couldn't tax. They wanted to get rid of the EPA. They wanted to get rid of pretty much of the federal government. And the historical view of this group was that the robber barons were America's heroes, and that the Gilded Age really was the Golden Age. And it was a completely revisionist view of America. And Charles Koch was so supportive of it, he became a trustee of the school.
We're talking to Jane Mayer. And when we come back, I want to find out about her own history in investigating the Kochs. Did that lead to an investigation of her and her reporting? And continue to talk about the size of the operation. Again, as we said at the beginning of the show, the Republican and Democratic parties are expected to spend each something like $1 billion in the 2016 elections. There's another party that's going to spend about that much, not a political party per se, but it is the $900 billion of this $900 million, close to $1 billion, that we're looking at today. Jane Mayer is staff writer for The New Yorker. Her book is called Dark Money, The Hidden History of the Billionaires Behind the Rise of the Radical Right. Stay with us.